Today, we're going to be talking about design review panels and community review panels. Earlier in the year, Stop the Towers and along with Harbinder Birdie met with James Murray MP and Rupert Huck MP to talk about the problems of planning in Ealing and to present the idea of a standing design review panel. James and Rupert were keen on this idea and wrote to the council the very next day. Ealing now appears to have committed to this idea, so it feels like a good time to talk about design review panels and community review panels and how they might help. So what are they? What's their purpose? And are they any good? Can they solve the problems we're having in Ealing? And also, why doesn't Ealing currently already have a standing design review panel? With me today, we have Councillor Peter Mason, who was up until recently Cabinet Member for Housing, Planning and Transformation at Ealing Council. We have Harbinder Birdie, who is a partner and head of infrastructure and transport sector at Hawkins Brown, and Dr. Gerald Power from Stop the Towers and the Drayton Community Association. So the first question, Harbinder, what is a design review panel and what's its purpose?
The design review panel is a collection of specialists from the built environment, which can comprise of architects, landscape architects, engineers, urbanists, who are there to comment and be constructive in terms of their criticism on developments or proposals that are being put forward by both private developers as well as local authorities. And what they really are is a way for specialists in the field, particularly of those developments that are coming forward, to be able to comment and improve the designs that are being tabled. Now, I sit on two design review panels, one for HS2 and the other one for Croydon Council as well. And with my background being a specialist in infrastructure, I'm usually reviewing schemes that usually involve development on or around or near transport nodes. So typically with a design review panel, you'll have specialists that have expertise in the proposals that are being put forward. And what they do is that they aid the local authority to be able to comment on the proposals that are being tabled.
Ealing currently don't have a standing design review panel. Why not?
Justin, thanks very much for inviting me. I just wanted to kind of say from the outset, it's really pleased to be part of the discussion. I am doing it in a kind of a personal capacity. I'm not speaking on behalf of either the Labour Group or the administration. I'm no longer a member of the cabinet, but this is an area that I kind of continue to have a professional and a political interest in. So it's good to be part of the discussion. Ealing has used design review panels in the past, particularly on large schemes. Now, those have tended to be design review panels that have that have existed. But Ealing didn't necessarily have, if you like, a standing panel for which it controlled the membership of. Partly that's just a reflection of how the council has operated over the last few years. It's a reflection of the financial challenges that the council's had around its development management team and the extent to which it had to make savings. But equally, it's a reflection on kind of the scale of development. And from all of those earliest conversations that we had, I was very keen to make sure that we looked not just to do a design review panel, but also look at how we can look to other bits of good practice in the development sector and the development industry around things like community review panels that have been very successful in places like Old Oak and Park Royal.
So as mentioned in the intro, we've been talking to you for most of this year about the design review panel. So before you left Ealing Council, you were in the process of setting one up along with the community review panel, which we'll talk about towards the end. How's the process going so far? Or how was it going before you left? And now you've gone, who's working on this? And will they be as committed as you?
So look, I've stepped down from the cabinet. I'm not leaving the council. I continue to represent the good people of Southall Green, and will remain kind of involved in I'm sure kind of many of the discussions around the built environment. Just before I left the cabinet, we got to the point of, if you like, giving both the design review panel and the community review panel the green light. And effectively, a council's got to go through a process. It's got to make a decision. It's got to give its officers resources to kind of move things forward. And what we'd said at that point was, green light, DRP and CRP, that they should happen. And the officers would kind of work with the leading councillors to start the appointment process, particularly for the DRP, but then work out, if you like, terms of reference and how the community review panel would happen. But it was very much confirmation that they will happen. This isn't a question of if, it's now a question of when.
Okay, that's really encouraging. Just going back to what you said before, you talked about budgets. I'm just going to shoot forward to a question earlier that I've got a bit later on. Who meets the costs of these design review panels? Because my understanding is it's developers pay for it. Harbinder, can you answer that question?
Yes, it typically is. I mean, when you look at the Croydon Design Review panel, the fees that are paid to the members on that panel, they're actually funded by the developer. And actually, the feedback has been from the developers that actually they really enjoy tabling their proposals at the design review panel, because they're getting experts who are improving the design. And so I think there's this sort of myth in terms of the cost, in terms of the local authority having to cover those costs, because essentially you'll be the developer.
Interesting. Peter, just to go back very quickly, with so much development in the borough, wouldn't it have made sense to have had one up and running a few years back? I know you've probably answered that question before, but yeah, why now and why not before?
So I think 2 points on just a quick point on cost. Look, one of the things that we considered, and I think one of the conversations that I've had with Harbinder and Justine, I had with you at the time was, it is right that the developer meets the cost for both the design review panel and community review panels. But of course, what it doesn't do is it settles the issue of morally who's responsible for paying. Because of course, if a decision is made by a design review panel or a community review panel that a future community kind of might not be happy with, then of course it does leave the question of, what influence did the developer have in the context of paying the fee? And of course there'll be guards and safeguards and checks to make sure that there isn't inference. But of course, that's still a live and an ongoing debate that no doubt will happen. In terms of kind of why we're here, look, I mean, the progress in local authorities is slow, and that's not just the case for Ealing. That's pretty much local government across the board. It's really difficult to hear, I know, but local authorities have been under significant strain and pressure for a considerable period of time, and there's 2/3 less money rolling around a council budget than there was 10 years ago. And what that means is development management teams, planning teams in local government are much smaller than they were a decade ago, and their ability to be able to kind of process the volume of work that's in front of them is a challenge. And viewing things like DRPs and CRPs do provide additional bits of work that they have to do. And that's not just about necessarily paying for the professionals or who are involved in that process. It's also an additional thing that they've got to do. It's an additional layer of management. So there are, it is resource intensive. And particularly for a borough like Ealing, that has significant development pressure because of things like Crossrail. So the volume's quite high. But I think it's right that we have it in place, and I'm pleased that we're going to start to now see the fruits of that labour.
Harbinder, so how is a design review panel normally set up? Who decides who's on it? Is each one ad hoc, or is it a standing one? And should the members of the panel be local, or should they have local knowledge? What's the remit? What are we looking for from these people?
Well, I mean, typically what happens with the design review panel is that the local authority will essentially invite specialists from the industry to actually submit their sort of CVs for the panel. And what you normally have is the local authority select a pool of interdisciplinary designers. Like I said, everything from sort of architects to landscape designers to urbanists to engineers. And typically that pool would range from between 30 to 40 designers. And what they really want to do is make sure that they have a good spread across all the various disciplines. And they will be asking in those submissions if there's any sort of conflicts of interest. So I think the Croydon Design Review panel has about, say, 40, HS2 has about, say, 40 to 50 panel members. So there are organisations that can help set up design review panels. some of which are actually working for managing the design review panel for HS2. I think what's important though to stress is that when a scheme comes forward, the design review panel may actually review it 2 to 3 times before it's submitted finally for planning submission. And typically the reason why they have a large pool of specialists is so that what you can get is a panel that can actually see and contribute and comment on the design over a period of time, so there's continuity. And what they're very keen on doing is making sure there's availability. Your point regarding the members and should they be local, I suppose in a way that's a difficult, because members, I mean, if you think about, I mean, with COVID now, I suppose in a way everybody is a lot more in tune in terms of the village that they live in, right? So they really, really care about their neighborhood. And actually, if you have specialists within their field who are really keen to contribute to the new proposals that are coming forward, I think actually it probably is wise to have them on the panel, but I am mindful in terms of the conflicts that might occur. So I think in selecting the panel, what you do need to do is essentially get the best people in their field who are used to designing and reviewing buildings of this type within London, so that they are able to comment on the challenges. And regarding the cost, I mean, we've discussed that. I totally agree with Peter. There is an administration cost within the council because somebody will have to manage this, and that is no small undertaking. However, all the boroughs that we work with in terms of the design review panel, what we know is that we as architects, we benefit a lot from actually having our work peer reviewed by others. And so what we found is that all of our proposals that we submitted, they are all improved through the design review panel.
So is it a bit like a show and tell for architects?
Well, I wouldn't say show and tell, because I think what there is that there's a continual, what happens is that you have a pool of designers that are trying to create the best buildings that they can. And what they do is that they learn from each other. And I think that's no bad thing. But one of the things is to do a review of other people and to comment. We are learning from other people, and that's what we do. And the design review panels that are held are a way of doing that. And you can imagine this having this ripple effect across the whole of London. And the mayor has his own design review panel, right? So essentially, I think probably 60% of boroughs have design review panels, and they have the finest minds commenting on the built environment. And I think Ealing needs one as well.
Yeah, sounds great. Is what Harbinder's saying, is that pretty much what we're going for in Ealing? In terms of the kind of people that are going to be on it, the kind of the size of the other, so 40 to 60 people on the panel, is that what we're going for?
So look, I mean, I'm not going to be privy to the precise detail anymore. That's now in the kind of the hands of my successor. But certainly the intent when we set out was that it would be, a big enough panel that you can get enough kind of expertise, not necessarily just from architects, but also from kind of other people who are involved in accredited built environment professions, whether that's planners and people who are much more kind of focused on place-based urban design. So not just about the building per se, but how it knits into its surrounding. Landscape architects too, who've got the ability to think about how green and amenity space also knits into placemaking. But and even kind of chartered surveyors who who've got the expertise to bring to the table about and challenge architects. There are new methods of construction that are available. That actually there's a growing kind of school of thought within chartered surveyors who are able to challenge on things like zero carbon or low emissions. So getting all of those professional experiences around the table to really look underneath the bonnet of a particular development is really important. And of course, it opens the question of, well, then how big does a panel need to be? And do you need to bring in special expertise for particular developments? So should it be 12 or should it be 20? And do you have it evolving and revolving depending on what the scenario is? But those are important questions that probably need to be worked through in the next few weeks and months.
So they would look at. So they'd look at a development on its own, but they'd look at it within the context of the environment it's in and the area and how much development is going on around it. Is that what we're saying? It would take into account?
Yeah, absolutely. Good development in the 21st century isn't just about building isn't just about plonking down a block and changing the facade and doing the internal layouts. The world's moved on. The world's moved on to a better understanding of urban design, and that's about the fabric of the building, but also other stuff. It's about how the building pertains to health, how it promotes health, how it tackles climate change, and thinking about all of those different factors, not just in its like immediate footprint, but in its surrounding areas, but also overall. That's new. It's not. It's not that new, but it's still a kind of a challenge for many of the professionals involved in the built environment to really kind of embed and take on board. And that's why having these forums and having that, if you like, peer challenge that Harbinder talks about is so important.
Gerald, going over to you now. So a lot of resident groups have indicated that there's a very strong need for the design review panel in Ealing. So I think you're going to get a lot of public support, a lot of support from the various campaign groups that are out there or residents associations. Gerald, I know you're not that familiar with them. In the past when we've spoken, you've seemed a little bit sceptical. What are your thoughts, having heard what Harbinder and Peter have said?
Well, I can't say I disagree with anything that either of them have said, and I think that they could be a really good thing, and that they could transform the way that planning is done in Ealing. But my big reservation about it is that I just don't think that they can have any positive effect with the way that planning currently happens at Ealing, in terms of, I think you'd need a systemic change in the way that the planning process works in order for the design review committee to fit in. I was making some notes as you were talking, but the first one was on the timing, that there's been a consistent pattern of the community consultation happening very much at the end of the process. After the architects, the developer, the GLA, the council have maybe been talking to each other for 12 to 18 months and developing the design to quite a finished level, at which point nobody really wants to change anything. And it makes it really difficult for a community to respond. Also, we're being asked to respond in a matter of weeks on quite complicated plans that had maybe taken a year or more to develop. So I think if the design review committee is going to have any kind of impact, community engagement and design reviews got to start at the kind of concept stage of the site, before the developer's really committed to any particular design or direction. And also there needs to be a dialogue where, as the design develops, it can go back to the community. And also, what you didn't mention was the local development plans, or you may have mentioned them, but I think that needs to be a really important part of it, because individual buildings in isolation, it's difficult to assess their impact. But if we look at, say, the Uxbridge Road between West Ealing and the Broadway, it's seen huge transformation over the last 10 years. Each building in its own right probably made sense, but I'd argue that that corridor of hotel tower blocks, does it make sense as a whole design feature? Maybe, maybe not. So I'd say the design review, it's got to be part of a new approach to planning, where we go in much earlier in the process and part of that bigger picture of development. And the final thing is we need a voice, because I get a sense of deja vu on this, because I remember being involved in the community forum discussions and seeing people like Eric Leach sweat blood in terms of getting the funding to develop that, commissioning the research, drafting it, putting the proposal to Ealing, getting it accepted, and then seeing that essentially swept away and being told that it didn't actually count anymore. So I think that,
Gerald, I'm going to interrupt you on that one, because we're going to come back to that towards the end when we talk about community review panels. So I will come back.
So can I just put it back to Peter and Harbinder, that are there any kind of enablers that you think we need in order to make the design review panel actually work and be effective?
Yeah, and Gerald, you've identified like a significant number of barriers that exist in planning, not just in Ealing, but like in planning fundamentally, right?
Yeah.
And we could probably do an entire podcast on the planning white paper and the direction that the government want to take in terms of moving public engagement to plan making and taking it out of development management, off of the agenda that actually apparently there are too many people who are obstructive to change, and therefore, better that they are involved in one conversation every 7 years rather than an ongoing dialogue around individual planning applications, right? And I know that it's difficult to have the conversation. I know that it's challenging for communities to hear politicians and professionals say, we've got to operate within rules. There is a process. There's a set of rules that developers and councils have to operate by, that are determined through a national planning policy framework, that determine things like financial viability, that stack the odds against not against developers, for developers, and against local authorities, and mechanisms through which that they can negotiate out of commitments to things like the affordable housing offer that they offer, or the contributions that they make to improve the local community. These are really big, challenging barriers. But you're right to say, and I absolutely agree with you, that good development is one where developers engage with communities at the earliest stage. So, and I'm sure Harbinda will talk about it, there's a REBA cycle, right? And the REBA cycle gives professionals guidance about what they should be doing at various different points of a development. And for before 2013, it didn't contain that really important stage that you talked about, which is project inception, right? Which is before the design brief is even written, what should we be looking at for this particular space? And that's a really important conversation that shouldn't just involve architects and planners. I think it's got to involve communities, and there are new, and that's an important point.
And can I add one other thing on the cost side? Because I can perhaps see it from both sides, being a member of the community, but also sometimes wearing the other hat, and looking to develop things. That it does feel a bit unfair on some of the developers to see them take a plan, invest potentially millions of pounds in it, and then get it rejected at planning because it was so profoundly out of keeping with the wishes of the community. And it just feels like it would save everybody an enormous amount of time, trouble, heartache, and friction if we could actually get people involved in the early parts of the cycle. But it feels at the moment that Ealing does everything it can to prevent that. I'll not get into details, but there does seem to be a pattern of early conversations with developers, but in very, very late conversations with communities.
I'm not sure it's a fair characterization, and you can expect me to say that. The planners and developers have rules through which they operate, and it's a developer that brings forward a development. Yes, it's a local authority that sets a local plan, and we were certainly at the start of reviewing it and looking at things like characterization studies and involving people much more in the process of what the big ideas are. But fundamentally, it's not a planning authority that brings forward a planning application. It's a developer. And if a developer decides to engage communities at the inception stage of their project, then fantastic. And I take the view that local authorities should encourage that. But ultimately, it's the agent of change that has to bear the responsibility for what the development looks like. And a local authority is governed by a set of rules and a set of laws to assess that. And if they step outside of those boundaries, they give the agent of change the ability to challenge that decision. And invariably you end up in the planning inspectorate or even in the courts. So, I get that perception, and I'm with you in terms of how, in an ideal world, that should happen. But I do think sometimes we can be a little bit unfair to the people who have to operate the rules rather than the ones who set what those rules are.
Yeah, I think it's fair though, as a resident or somebody who to have feelings like that though. I mean, because we can't deny that.
Absolutely.
What kind of developments would the design review panel look at? How effective is their decision, and what's the point of them? Harbinda, I'll quickly go to you because I know we need to talk about community review panels and we are running quite short on time. So what kind of developments are they looking at? Are they looking at my extension? Are they looking at Ealing Broadway as a whole? What are they doing? What are they looking at? Harbinda?
I think they can. I mean, they typically wouldn't look at small domestic proposals, but what they will be looking at is essentially projects that are very much in the sort of public domain. This is landscape. This would be private development, housing, etc., infrastructure. So essentially, very much proposals that, if you're walking down the street and you're going to engage with it, that's the ones that they're going to be doing. Now, for Croydon, I've looked at a market. It was a small little pop-up market, but it was in the public realm. So actually, sometimes they can be very small. But on the other hand, you're then reviewing Euston Station for HS2 as well. So it's a complete spectrum, but it's very much in the sort of like public domain. What was your next question?
How effective is their decisions?
I mean, currently at the moment, I know that Peter, Ealing have commissioned designers to look at the various potential development opportunities in various villages within Ealing. And one of the projects that we did, which was around East Croydon Station, we actually did effectively a development strategy for the area around East Croydon Station, and they went out to public consultation. The public came and they engaged and they looked at the density around the transportation node, and that was very much at the master planning stage. So we took on board their comments at a very early stage. Now, this was something that was commissioned by Croydon Council and Network Rail in joint venture. So what they said was that for us to unlock the potential for the infrastructure and for us to carry out the works, this is the development. And then what developers like is the fact that, I see, so actually the community, the council and Network Rail, they brought into this level of density. So we know what it is that we can really build. And I think that if boroughs can have that approach, then what they are doing is that they're hearing from the community, or at least the community knows what the vision is for their area, and they can actually meaningfully engage. And I think that is critical. And I knew the white paper that is being submitted for plan works on that basis. And I think what the borough should really do is encourage developers to engage as early as possible.
Gerald.
Yeah, I really like the idea of that, and it makes me think very much of West Ealing, because I can see that we've got two big sites there on Manor Road and Hastings Road. We've also got a big strip of land that runs by the railway down from the station to the green. We've got lots of potential sites to develop. We've got Waitrose.
Can we just say we're not encouraging people to develop those sites?
No, but the reality is it's land that will be developed and should be developed. And it just feels to me that now would be the time for a conversation with the community, particularly with the Green Man Estate and the developments on the Uxbridge Road, to say, what do we want this place to look like in 10 years' time? What's the level of density? How are these developments going to push off each other? And then Peter mentioned the idea of the developer as the agent of change. Then when the agent of change comes in, they can see what the area plan looks like, what the site-specific plan looks like, what the evidence looks like, and also they can see what the adjacent plots are probably going to be used for. And then maybe we can get some quite rapid but good development going on, and also with a lot less community friction.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the problem with Manor Road is the fact that it wasn't, hey guys, what do you think of this? It was, oh, by the way, you're getting a tower. I think it just really annoyed people really quickly, because it was no one likes to be told you're getting something. If you work with people, you can slowly ease things in, and like you can look at all the development and look at it in context and work out how many units are there, keeping a tally on exactly how many houses are being built, how much development, how much more we need, how much of it is social, how much of it is London Living Rent, how much of it is shared ownership. Is that adequate? So Harbinder, I know that you're working with sites that are close to transport hubs. The thing with building right on a transport hub like Crossrail, that if you've got people living 20 yards from a station entrance, they're not actually engaging in the community. They're not using local shops on their way to work. They're not coming out of their house, popping to the newsagent. They're not going to grab a coffee from the local coffee shop. They're just going straight, it's dormitory living, straight to the train station and then going. So it's almost looking at developments that are slightly away from that hub, that you don't have to necessarily maximize density right on top of the station. It could be somewhere else. So I think the whole thing just needs looking at. What do you think, Harbinder?
I think we shouldn't underestimate the challenge of building next to the tracks. And the reason why currently you don't have integrated stations with oversight development is because the land is owned by different parties. Okay, so one is a rail operator, whose interests are to actually get people on the train and make sure that there's a safe train network running. And the other one is development. And who knows when the development is actually going to come along. Now, Crossrail and the central sections have very much developed. They've integrated oversight developments on the station, but that's because of the land value. So building above a station costs a lot more money. Building across a track costs a hell of a lot of money. And whichever way you look at it, building above the track will never pay for the infrastructure. I think the only place that it does that is in Hong Kong. But I maybe disagree with your point regarding people living on the 10th floor of a development and just popping into the station and getting their coffee in Soho, which is 14 minutes away. I don't think that will happen. I think there will be a ripple effect across the high street. And if you look at how people are going to be living now, the white collar worker is going to be working from home 3 days a week. What they will be doing is they won't be in their flats 3 days a week. They will be in the coffee shops with their computers working. They will looking for places where they can meet other people to meet. So if anything, because of the post-COVID world that we're living in, it will be transformational for the various villages. If anything, you'll probably get the finest coffee in the whole of London in Ealing, simply because of Crossrail and the people that are moving in.
It would be great to have a broader discussion of that, and it needs to be part of the planning for the community, because Harbinder's completely right. The world is changing, the way people live and work is changing, and when we try and redevelop an area like West Ealing or Hanwell or Ealing city centre, we need to kind of envision that new world and try and create that architectural mix that supports it, and not just that, but that's robust for maybe 50 years. Because I mean, I look at the houses in the Draytons, and they've been here about 120 years. They've seen umpteen generations go through them, and they've adapted to different ways of living and working. And it will be good to see some thought of flexibility in the neighbourhood rather than just single units to solve single issues.
But I think, can I jump in here? Because I think there's even a bigger question at play, which is actually how does the world beyond COVID within cities? So much of the debate and discussion around growth in a place like London is tempered, rightly, as Harbinder says, by land value. And ultimately, that's the one big deciding factor that pretty much controls everything that happens in the built environment, right? You know, forget rules, forget agency, it's land value. And when you have a city like London that is the capital of the country and basically contains all of the country's major industries, whether it's finance, whether it's media, whether it's, you know, just the center of power, a lot of people want to live here. A lot of people want to come to London. And if you don't have regional investment strategies and you don't have centres of economic growth outside of London, then the more people that want to come here are going to push up land value, because there's going to be greater demand. And when you put all of your nation's kind of collective infrastructure investment into a city like London, then you're only going to make that land value increase. And when the land value increases, therefore, you've got to build denser and you've got to build taller, because that's the only way you're going to be able to meet housing targets. Actually, if London and the country wants to have a sensible conversation about development overall, it would be talking about regional investment, because ultimately, you know, patterns of our lives are going to be different beyond COVID. How many of our friends and relatives have already moved in the last 7 months, 8 months to different parts of the country because they want a better quality of life? How many people were doing that before COVID, knowing that they wanted to get out to the countryside, you know, maybe when they started having kids or had the ability to do that? So I think there are some really bigger, major questions at play in terms of how growth is going to work in the UK, but also in a city like London. Those are big questions that need to be answered. We're going to still have the same kind of challenges in the short term about putting together a local plan and about what developers bring forward and what the design of it will be. But, you know, we have to be able to have sensible conversations as a community to be able to start preempting some of those big changes in our lives that are going to happen.
So we seem to have moved seamlessly onto community review panels. So let's just Peter, can you just briefly explain what they are? I think we've kind of talked about what the point of them is. So is this what we're going to have with Ealing? These have been green light lit as well, haven't they?
Yeah. So they've been green lit, and we're using the model that the Old Oak Park Rural Development Corporation have had for the community review panel in their area. And if you think about that particular part of London, it's a really difficult regeneration site, because it's principally industrial and contains all those problems of lots of train tracks that people don't want to build over because it's too costly. And the idea is to take people from a community, not ones who are already involved, right? Not ones who've already got a voice through either campaigning or through just being very involved in the development management process, and taking a group of people on a journey that involves and engages them in those big challenges that we've been discussing today, and asking them effectively to do the same job as the design review panel. And it's not a question of replacing anybody or not listening to other people, but simply an additional layer of discussion and review that enables more people to be involved and engaged in those big conversations and big challenges about what development looks like. And so operate a similar process whereby they can look at a plan, engage with the developer, and think about what the consequences or the benefits and the risks will be, and that assessment to kind of form another part of how both planners and politicians at a planning committee think about when they decide whether or not something should be given permission or not.
So how many are you looking to have?
So again, I'm not involved in the precise detail anymore, but certainly kind of not me. But when we set out on that journey, the idea was that gradually we wanted, if you like, 7 community review panels to represent, if you like, the 7 kind of conurbations of the borough. So Southall, Acton, Ealing, Hanwell, Greenford, Northolt, Perivale, and that we would be able to kind of find enough people who'd be willing to be part of that process in each one of those panels, so that we could actually begin the process of community-led regeneration, which is a theme that we've discussed previously, but really elevate the discussion about plan-led development and engaging and expecting people to be involved very much at the start of that process, and communities to be involved in that process. So
do they get any power? Can they turn stuff down? Can they work with the design review panel? Can they say, I don't agree with this, or what's the point of them?
Well, it's very similar to a design review panel, right? So even a design review panel doesn't really have the ability to refuse a planning application. They can work with the developer to say, we like it or we don't like it, we need you to change this, that, or the other, and here are our recommendations. Ultimately, the developer can say no, but of course, if a design review panel's given a very strong opinion, the developer hasn't done it, then when it gets to a planning committee or it gets to an officer, you would anticipate that they'd be able to see those two things next to each other and say, well, that's a good enough reason to say no. And it's a similar principle for the community review panel, that you should be able to offer advice, guidance, and recommendations. And if the developer takes those recommendations on board, then great. If they decide not to, then that's a really clear red flag as to the approach that the developer's taken to listening to people's opinions and people's ideas and feedback.
Gerald, what's your thoughts on the community review panel? Can you just recap what you were saying earlier about Eric Leach sweating blood?
Well, I think it's to summarise it.
Can you say who Eric Leach is as well?
Eric Leach is somebody that's been involved in local planning and community issues for decades now, and he really embraced the idea of community forums. And he converted what was a community group, I think West Ealing Neighbours, into a community forum which has a legal status and allows it to create a neighbourhood plan. And the crux was an enormous amount of effort went into creating that plan and consultation and getting approval. But ultimately, it looks like it's had no sway whatsoever. It's been completely disregarded in terms of developments on the Uxbridge Road and on the proposals that went in on Manor Road. So there's a lot of people in the community that are probably feeling very cynical about this. And the phrase that was used by somebody was rope-a-dope. And I think it was in the context of essentially, let's just get all of these community groups working very, very hard over here on this engagement process. Let them use all their energy up on that. We're not going to listen to them in the end, but it's much better that they're over in that corner having these debates than getting out canvassing politically.
Peter, what do you think?
Yeah, so Gerald, you're entirely right, but where have neighbourhood forums come from? Neighbourhood forums came from the 2011 Localism Act, right?
I remember it well. I remember its funeral.
Yeah. They are a particular approach to planning, right? Which is a permissive approach to planning, right? The idea is a neighbourhood forum is the lowest tier of a planning process that has to be subordinate to everything that's above it. And
No, wait, Peter, is that actually true? Because with
yeah,
this came. I mean, when we talked to our
Yeah.
planning barristers,
yeah,
they were very clear on the issue that there isn't an absolute hierarchy in these things, in that they all have weight and they all need to be considered. And
yeah.
it isn't the question of like the national, the London plan is the one that carries most weight and your community plan carries the least one. It was the idea that they should all be aiming for the same kind of goals. So to say that the community forums plan is the lowest in the hierarchy would be to, I think, misrepresent it.
So the thing about barristers and solicitors, and I've dealt with a lot of them in the last couple of years for things that aren't to do with development management, that are well documented in the press, is that they give you the opinion you pay for, right? And that's not to criticise you for taking the advice of a barrister or a solicitor, right? They've given you the opinion you pay for, and likewise, any local authority worth its salt, if they want to make a legal argument, they'll get the barrister to tell them what they want to hear. My background is planning, right? And there is a concept of general conformity that a neighbourhood forum has to be in conformity to a local plan. And actually, we've seen the reports from the National Planning Inspectorate. I read them when they came through both on West Ealing and on other parts of the borough. If the neighbourhood forum's local plan isn't in conformity with the local plan or the National Planning Policy Framework, the Planning Inspectorate has the ability simply to tell them to change it, and they did. Right? It's not about necessarily the goodwill and the intention of people like Eric Leach, who do a lot in the community to try and engage people in conversations about planning. It's about the way in which those forums and those decisions are structured. I'm not a fan of neighbourhood forums because I think they do precisely the opposite of what they set out to do, which is, it fails the Ronseal test, because on the tin it says empowering local communities to be in control of their neighbourhoods and to create ideas and expressions about how communities should change for the better. The reality is the legislation doesn't give them those powers.
Well, I think that's one thing we can agree on, that
Yeah.
they do not do what they promise to do. And I think what I'm saying is they don't do it. Why should local residents groups believe that these community forums are going to do it? Why shouldn't they just kind of go in a more aggressive way politically on this one?
Well, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, but as we've discussed already in this conversation, plan-led development and plan-led growth is fundamentally about the plan. It's about how you put together the plan and who's involved in that plan. And I would hope that most people would see the need for many, many voices to be involved in the direction and the vision for Ealing, but also London and the UK. And at the moment, the structural way that you do that is through a local plan, but also the rules that are set nationally. And actually, we've got this really interesting and important window that's happening right now, which is the government are rewriting the rules for planning. And we have a planning white paper that will determine how local authorities will be expected to come up with those visions in the long term. And I think people should definitely be contributing to that. And we're certainly at the start of a process of reviewing Ealing's local plan. I'm not going to be leading that process anymore. It'll be up to my successors. But I would hope that the goodwill that we tried to build at the beginning and opening up those conversations for people to be engaged with will continue. I want to see that happen. And I think, everybody wants to see that happen.
I'd dearly love to see that happen, but I suppose even just 2 years of fighting in this planning thing has made me slightly cynical.
Yeah. We've coined a few phrases like "totally towered" means you're totally exhausted. It's like we got a whole new vocabulary. Harbinder, you've been a little bit quiet. What's your thoughts on community review panels? I don't think any of us will be invited to them by the sounds of it, Peter.
There are lots of people that live in the borough who have a view on how the borough will evolve. And actually, I would say that they're not being listened to. And I think the community design review, the community panels really need to be able to listen to the people that aren't typically listened to. And because what you would normally get is the people that are more vocal are the ones that generally have an interest, etc. But there's Ealing has a populace of 360,000, I think. I think it's the second largest borough in the whole of London. what do people really want? What is the vision? And actually, if what we can do is listen to the people of the borough, and then from that, what at sort of, council level, set a vision for the borough, then what we're doing is we're sort of developing the borough based on what people really want from it. And actually, we talk about high density and people are sort of against it. There's a lot of people out there who I'm sure actually really want it. I mean, if you look at, Ealing, we benefited, I always say it, from this sort of £18 billion magic carpet that's going to take us into central London in a no time. Did we pay for that? As in, like, so when that comes, there will be development. The only thing is that what we do need to do is make sure that that development is of the finest quality. And because you develop next to the tracks, it's very easy for projects like that to run over budget or be low quality, because there's lots of cost in actually putting the structure in the ground. And so what we do need to do is have a network of peer review, where what they can do is go to make sure that all the money is spent in the finest quality architecture, because essentially the buildings are going to be there for the next 100 years. And actually what happens at the ground plane, what happens, what is the uses at the ground plane, what happens in the public realm, where are the amenities, etc. Post-COVID, when someone's living in one of these dual aspect flats, how big should they really be, for them to actually, and all these questions, developers now are scratching their head, go, well, how do people want to live? Because what they really want to do is sell their flats. What we want to do is just have fantastic development. And so the design review panel, I think the community review panel has to be a way of engaging the people in the community that normally aren't listened to. And then I think that has to be rolled out into the network, which is the schools, etc. Because these are the people that we want to stay in the borough. We don't want them to be moving out. And so I think it's about demystifying what we really do. And so whenever there is a consultation meeting, etc., in the town hall, etc., people always criticize that actually you've got the same people turning up all the time. And actually, there's so many more voices and thoughts and ideas out there. And I think, how do we tap into them?
I think that's very true. Actually, I think that's quite a few people pointed out. There are actually a lot more people coming forwards with a voice. Harbinder, I think we're going to end on this, but Harbinder, just what you were saying about post-COVID living, people living in their dual aspect apartment. What about the people living in a single aspect apartment? Things like any new development with north-facing windows. One north facing shouldn't even be allowed to be.
I just think that what developers need to do now is that people need to look at if people are going to be spending 60% of their time within their dwellings, market forces will determine it, because what people will be doing, they look around the flats going, I'm going to move to that block over there because it's better designed for how I want to live. And I think developers are now picking up on that. And so I think they are, and they will, things will change. I mean, at the moment, from January, every single office in central London is going to be redesigned. They're not getting smaller. People aren't letting their offices go, because essentially they're only going to have 40% of their workforce in the office. The other 60% of the footplate is essentially just meeting rooms with lots of screens, because everybody's going to be working just 2 days a week in the office. And what will happen now is that our homes are going to follow.
Yeah. I think we can leave it there. Thank you. Any final thoughts? Peter, Gerald, any more thoughts?
Well, I am, on the one hand, enthusiastic that this could work and should work. It is like the kind of shining path to a new Ealing, like engagement and consultation and the best of design. But at the same time, I feel we will have to do so much to get down that road. It won't just happen.
Peter?
Look, politics is plural, right? And it should involve and it should engage everybody's voice. And I'm a big kind of believer in this notion of kind of agonistic politics, right? That actually it's fine for people to disagree, that you should be able to bring your thoughts and your opinions to the table. We don't need to slag each other off. We don't need to have a go at each other or question people's motives or just to say how evil each other is. We've had enough of that, right? We've had enough of that and America's had enough of that, and we've had enough of that in Europe. But if we create spaces in which people can come together to genuinely express their genuinely held views, that we have the ability to listen, to hear and to understand and to reflect and then decide, we can get a better situation. That doesn't just count for like politics, that counts for the built environment too. And and for me, this has been a great conversation, and I hope that this is reflective of actually how those conversations can happen in the future. But thank you very much.
I think that's a good place to end. I don't think anybody can argue with those sentiments.
No, thank you.